In the 7th grade, I had an English teacher I adored, whose name was Preston Musgrove. We boys, seizing on his unusual name the way boys that age will, took to calling him Uncle Preston behind his back. In the springtime, the last day before Easter weekend, I was in a classroom after classes were over, and I saw him walking on a breezeway and yelled out the window, "Goodbye, Uncle Preston." Well, he marched right in and had me follow him to his classroom, where he wrote out a note to my parents, sealed in an envelope. I was to have them sign that they had read it and return the signed copy to him without fail after the long holiday weekend. That was over 50 years ago, and I can still remember how that envelope burned in my knapsack all weekend. Tuesday morning, at about the last minute before I went to school, I presented the notes to my parents. It turned out to be a fairly mild rebuke. My mother grasped the situation immediately, that I had been suffering the pangs of guilt all weekend, and declared that I had been punished enough. I wrote out a sincere apology to my teacher and never called him names again. At the other end of the guilt spectrum, let's consider Lady Macbeth. By Act 5 of the play, she has engineered the deaths of a whole slew of people who stood in the way of her husband being king, and the guilt has become so crippling, she sleepwalks in the castle, imagining her hands covered with blood and having an imaginary conversation with Macbeth. "Out, damn spot! Out, I say! 1, 2, why, then 'tis time to do it! Hell is murky. Fie, my lord, fie! A soldier and a feared? What need we fear who knows it, when none can call our power to account?" Yet who would have thought the old man to have had so much blood in him? Guilt. It can be a mild discomfort. It can be a constant background irritation. It can be a crippling emotion that makes impossible either thought or action. It can lead to depression and even suicide. I'm talking about the emotion today, not the state of being guilty of a crime or wrongdoing, not what was done or left undone, but how one feels about it. It is a troubling emotion. It is an almost universal emotion, and it is a necessary emotion. Troubling because it comes on you unbidden, and sometimes it muscles out all of the feelings or agendas, and you can't turn it off. It's like one of those annoying ads that pops up on your computer and won't go away. At best, guilt nags. At worst, it brings everything else to a halt. It is almost universal. Most of us will feel guilt at some times because we have the capacity to feel guilt. About 1% of the population don't have that capacity, and these are called psychopaths. While we might toy with the idea of eliminating guilt from our lives, none of us would want to become psychopaths. Lady Macbeth probably thought she was a psychopath, but she wasn't, because the guilt was killing her. Guilt, you see, within limits is a necessary and useful emotion. It is a part of the fabric of our living in a social world where there's right and wrong, and where our words and actions have the power to harm others. Guilt is what we feel when we have transgressed a moral standard, a standard that we accept and try to live by, and to which we hold others. It is a necessary part of being human, that we have norms and standards of behavior, and often we only know where these are when someone violates them. Sometimes that someone will be ourselves. When we ourselves have done something that we would judge wrong if done by someone else, or left something undone which we ought to have done, guilt will arise as a natural and healthy result. I say healthy because guilt, if it doesn't cripple us, motivates us to take action to restore the moral balance. And more importantly, it deters us from upsetting that balance in the first place. One of the great motivators to do the right thing is the desire to avoid feeling guilty for doing the wrong thing. we learn to distinguish between guilt and shame. These are two emotions that resemble each other, but they have different origins and different resolutions. Guilt is a feeling of unease for something one has done, typically to another person. Shame is a more generalized feeling of wrongness, not I have done something wrong, but something's wrong with me. Either emotion can be crippling, but they are treated differently. The remedy for guilt is acknowledgement of the wrong done and, if feasible, making amends for it. The remedy for shame is acceptance, an affirmation that you are a worthy person. Now, to say that these negative emotions have a theoretical path to resolution is not to say that the path is easy or that people always take it. Guilt often lies unacknowledged or denied. I grew up in the segregated South at the time of the Civil Rights Movement. At the time the Civil Rights Movement was publicly pointing out the injustice of the system of white supremacy which prevailed then. Many in my family and our social circle did not want to recognize that many African Americans had little more power over their lives than they had had a century before under slavery. Out of the denial of guilt, they constructed a story, which many still believe, that blacks are inherently inferior or lazy or shiftless or criminal and deserve to be on the bottom of society. This is guilt perverted into denial and becomes vociferous denial if challenged. Where did you first learn guilt? It probably came in your early toilet training, but certainly by the time you were in kindergarten, you learned that doing the wrong thing made you feel bad. And the people who taught you this were your parents and your teachers and maybe your siblings. Guilt is internalized punishment, and being spanked or made to sit in the corner often did not hurt so much as the punishment children inflict on themselves with feelings of guilt. The scolding mom on the front of the order of service reminds us that guilt is an ever-present weapon in the parent's arsenal. And those of us who have been parents have used it on our children, just as our parents used it on us. I tried to be sparing with my children because I felt that my father had been a little over the top with me and my siblings. As a result, I ended up leaving most of the guilt tripping of my children to their mother, with the result that I am now a less threatening but also less present figure in their psyches. It has long been my feeling that our major religious traditions contribute their share to our feelings of guilt. And I've been looking for some nice cogent descriptions of the differences between the three greatest sources: Jewish guilt, Catholic guilt, and Calvinist guilt. I've never found such a description, so I'd like to float my own theories here, and you can take whatever rings true for you. The central text in Judaism is the Torah, and the overriding theme of the Torah is a covenant between God and the Jewish people. By the terms of this covenant, the Jews were supposed to be the chosen people. I will make of you a great nation, said God to Abraham. The problem was they were frequently getting oppressed or trod upon by the Egyptians, the Canaanites, the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Ptolemaic Greeks, and the Romans. The original scold was Moses, but then Moses was followed by a bunch of major and minor prophets. And the burden of all their messages was, you're in trouble today because you forgot your covenant. You didn't live up to your end of the bargain with God. Translate this into today's Jewish family. The essence of guilt is not living up to your obligations. So we have the old joke. How many Jewish mothers does it take to change a light bulb? One, if her son would ever call her, but that's okay, I'll just sit here in the dark. In some families, no matter how much attention and time the grown children give to their parents, it is never enough. Jewish guilt seems to be based on a failure to keep one's side of the obligation. Catholic guilt is something different. How many of you attended parochial schools? Okay. And how many of them did the teachers use guilt as a tool? I expect to get 100% on that. A central theme of Catholic guilt is sex. Not just sexual activity, but sexual thoughts as well. A Jewish kid learns that the essence of guilt is what he does or doesn't do, but the Catholic kid learns to feel guilty about thoughts as well as deeds. your have a mystical relationship with Jesus and the Blessed Virgin Mary, and they will be disappointed if you're thinking bad thoughts. This is a pretty severe sentence. Dr. Freud taught us that our minds are an ever-bubbling cauldron of repressed desires, and modern evolutionary science shows that the sex drives stem from the very thing that the sex drives are the very thing that keep the race going from generation to generation. So some thoughts about sex are a natural part of everyday life. How can we penalize them? When the Roman Catholic Church insists that your innermost thoughts can be sins and the subject of guilt, it also offers you a form of release in the institution of the confession. Now, lots of Christian churches have rituals of confession, but the Roman Catholic stands out by having the individual confession, in which the priest, acting as kind of a sentencing judge, prescribes what the confessor must do to expiate the guilt. Now, incidentally, is confession good for the soul? I think it needs to be used with a lot of mindfulness. It is entirely possible that confession of a harmful act in the past may inflict further harm. I heard recently about such a situation. Let's call them Alfred and Jane. They had been married 40 years, raised 3 children, when Alfred confessed to Jane that 10 years before he had had a 2-year affair with Jane's sister, Beth. Alfred may feel good about getting this off his chest, but he has just transferred the pain to Jane, who now must deal with betrayals by both her husband and her sister. This is a sin that would have been far better left unconfessed, or confessed to a disinterested professional in confidence. Now let's move on to the Calvinist guilt. Calvin held that everyone was inherently depraved since Eve had eaten the apple. Everyone was predestined to go to heaven or hell from before their birth. It was all in the hands of God, and most were going to hell. Calvinism was the religion brought to these shores by our Puritan ancestors, and it was the severity of Calvinism which, in the Enlightenment, spawned the liberal reactions we know today as Unitarianism and Universalism, and Unitarian Universalism. Here's a classic Calvinist description of the human condition from Jonathan Edwards' famous sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, in 1741. After pointing out how everyone is tainted with sin and everyone deserves eternal punishment, Edwards sums up with these words: "The use of this awful subject may be for awakening unconverted persons in this congregation. This that you have heard is the case of every one of you that are out of Christ. That world of misery, that lake of burning brimstone is extended abroad under you. There is the dreadful pit of the glowing flames of the wrath of God. There is hell's wide gaping mouth open, and you have nothing to stand on, nor anything to take hold of. There is nothing between you and hell but the air. It is only the power and mere pleasure of God that holds you up." End quote. Calvinist guilt in its pure form is existential guilt. It is all-pervasive. It arises not from our deeds or thoughts, but from the condition of life itself. Unitarianism and Universalism try to dispel this pervasive gloom of guilt, but they do not do away with it altogether. The Universalists in particular were attacked early on by Calvinists, who argued that without the threat of hell, no one would do good. So the Universalists adopted the position that virtue was its own reward. In the 1805 Winchester Profession of Faith, the Universalists stated, "We believe that holiness and true happiness are inseparably connected, and that believers ought to be careful to maintain order and practice good works, for these things are good and profitable unto men." But as virtue is its own reward, sin is its own punishment, and the purpose of guilt is to lead us away from bad deeds and toward the good. The great Universalist evangelist, Quillen Shin, at the beginning of the 20th century, opined that God had a plan of punishment, but the purpose was to cure us of our tendency to stray. Quote, "Under the divine government, punishment is spiritual medicine. What is its purpose? Love punishes to cure." So, This brings us then to modern liberal guilt. We don't sell guilt in our churches. I was struck with the contrast between our style of worship and conservative Christian styles when I went to the Oyster Pond service this summer and heard the pastor from the South Chatham Community Church. Most of his message was about sin and about wrestling with our own personal sins and, of course, bringing them to Jesus for forgiveness. I reflected that this emphasis probably spoke to a lot of the people who attended that church, but would not speak to people in our church. And liberals do have plenty of guilt. It does not tend to be about sexual or financial misdeeds, though there's plenty of that as well. It is more about our place in a social system, which seems pervaded with injustice. The system is rigged. It oppresses poor people and people of color, GLBT people and immigrants and Native Americans and the disabled. Most of us do not perceive ourselves on a day-to-day basis as among the oppressed, but we are aware of the injustices in the system, and that makes us feel guilty for a privileged position. We have white guilt, male guilt, straight guilt, affluent guilt, able-bodied guilt. And in an odd sense, this type of existential guilt stemming not from anything we have done or failed to do, but from our position in society, is the mirror of the all-pervasive Calvinist guilt. It simply comes with the territory. In this sense, liberals and conservatives are more alike than either wants to admit. We are all the prisoners of guilt. Now, I'm no friend of racism, and I think that all of us, of whatever color, have an obligation to the future to examine our own hearts and to try to root out racist ideas and especially racist behavior and words. But I've been through much anti-racist training and consciousness raising that is based on guilt, and I don't think it's particularly effective or helpful. When it comes to large social issues, what is most helpful is not our guilt, but our responsibility. We acknowledge that we do contribute to structures of oppression and take responsibility to do something to abate them within the limits of what is possible for us. More generally, is guilt useful as a motivator? After much thought, I've come to think of it as sort of like the J-stroke. When I was first taught to paddle a canoe, I was taught the J-stroke. When you paddle with a straight stroke, the canoe will go forward, but the bow will shift away from the side you're paddling on. You have the choice that to change sides or to do the J-stroke. If you finish the paddle stroke with a little stroke backward, you will correct for the steering problem. But of course, paddling backwards will counteract the forward paddle you just did and slow the boat down. Guilt is like that. It's a motivator to get us to go in the direction we need to go, but it slows us down. It's a drag on the spirits. After a while with the J-stroke, you learn to feather your paddle at the end of the stroke, to just turn it sideways in the water and use it like a rudder to subtly correct the course. It doesn't slow you down as much as the J-stroke. I think the equivalent moral course is gratitude. Gratitude, like guilt, corrects our course, but it doesn't waste energy fighting itself. Guilt is a little bit of self-loathing, and it diminishes us. What to teach your children and grandchildren? Empathy, compassion, gratitude. You don't need to teach guilt or lay it on them. They will absorb plenty by themselves. If we really have done something or left something undone that harms another, the remedy is to make amends, to apologize and make restitution within the limits I've already stated. But for the generalized guilt that keeps us awake at night, I think the remedy is to realize that perfection is not attainable in this life. To accept and forgive ourselves. We are all inadequate. If adequacy is being able to right every wrong, always say the right thing, do what needs to be done, and leave the rest alone. But this point of view is madness. We're all we need to be, and have all the love we need in the life we are living. It is enough that we do what we can. My great predecessor in this pulpit, Peter Fleck, said this much better than I in the conclusion of the essay I read from earlier, Making Our Peace with the Past. I will leave you with his words. Still I have sleepless nights, or at least sleepless hours trying to figure it out, trying to make things fit, trying to reinterpret past events in an effort to make them more acceptable, to get rid of some of the embarrassment, some of the feelings of inadequacy and failure they instilled in me, as well as the feelings of guilt I can only get rid of by forgiving myself. It is as if I have spent my life making pieces of a huge puzzle. How amazing and how gratifying that the pieces fit together and that in the still unfinished puzzle I can discern the pattern of my life. But in trying to complete the puzzle, I find that certain pieces are missing and others seem to have no place. And it is late in the day. I have no time to create the missing pieces, no time to restructure the puzzle in order to create room for the spare pieces. The whole thing doesn't add up, at least not with the high degree of perfection, which in my book would mean that all the pieces fit together, leaving no holes and no extras. But God does not seem to share my idea of perfection. And I begin to think that there are meant to be holes and spare pieces. Holes through which God's breath can flow. Spare pieces that suggest alternative arrangements of the puzzle. So these days I say to myself, what fits, fits. What does not is meant to stimulate me to greater creativity. From this point on, any further preoccupation with my past is a waste of time. The memories of negative experiences that shamed or embarrassed me are there, as they are in the lives of each and every one of us, unalterably, immutably. There's nothing any of us can do about them but accept them, live with them, and ultimately cherish them. Yes, cherish them. For lately I have come to believe that these negative experiences may be what life is all about. That success is not the absence of failure, but the overcoming of failure. Not the absence of weakness, but the overcoming of weakness. Not the absence of mistakes, but the acceptance of mistakes, which means the forgiving of mistakes. For we have the right to make mistakes. We are supposed to make mistakes. Things seem to be structured that way. If we were to be castigated, banished, thrown into outer darkness for having made mistakes, life would add up to a practical joke. And I do not believe it is. We will make our peace with the past when we learn to forgive ourselves for what we have done and left undone, and then learn to live with both. Amen. And now